in Lebanon and then moved to the UK for graduate studies, and then for postdoctoral work and for a lectureship at Goldsmiths, University of London. Then I'm now established in Ireland, and I teach at Maynooth University.
And your background is social sciences and literary studies, is that right?
Yes, quite interdisciplinary, and it's probably part of growing up in the environment of war and socio-political negligence, but also a family very much interested in literature that brought all these interests in conflict and social affairs and literature and the arts together.
And tell me about where you work now. I had a narrow miss, nearly called it Maynooth University in Ireland. It's Maynooth.
It's not allowed.
And it's outside Dublin, right? Is it a rural campus?
Not really rural. It's in County Kildare. It's the only university town in Ireland, and it is surrounded by beautiful countryside, but it is quite close to Dublin, less than an hour from the capital, Dublin.
And how are you adapting to life there?
I've been in Ireland actually for personal reasons for 10 years, so I know Ireland very well. And I'm very happy to be in the intellectual environment of Maynooth, where the interests are very much interdisciplinarily orientated and very much close to questions of interculturalism and social justice that I'm interested in.
Thank you. Our guest this morning here on Weekend is Rita Sacre, who is a Lebanese-born lecturer at the University of Maynooth in Ireland. Coming up later this hour, by the way, was President Trump's sacking of his national security advisor, John Bolton, a sign that his foreign policy is becoming unhinged.
You have to take this out of the realm of politics and into the realm of abnormal psychology. When President Trump met with Vladimir Putin, he would do so without a national security advisor there. That is unprecedented. Those secret meetings with no records and no note takers. The whole point of the Trump foreign policy is it is fitful and impulsive.
We'll discuss later. Now, one of Africa's great liberation leaders has been remembered this weekend, although he was also one of its more brutal dictators. For 37 years, Robert Mugabe led Zimbabwe through good times and into economic ruin, having fought many years for its liberation from British colonial rule before he took power. He died just over a week ago. Our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding reports from yesterday's state funeral in the capital, Harare.
It's a warm, bright day in Harare's National Sports Stadium. Dozens of African leaders, past and present, veterans of the continent's liberation struggles, have been arriving over the past hour or so. Robert Mugabe's funeral service is about to get underway, but I think it's significant and telling that this stadium, which seats about 60,000 people, is by no means full. I'd say at most there were 6,000 or 7,000 people here, which tells you something. Robert Mugabe's coffin is now being brought in front of me here. Soldiers accompanying the coffin. Behind that, members of Mr. Mugabe's family, and then Emmerson Mnangagwa. But then became the man who pushed him out of power and took over from him 2 years ago.
Condolences to the Mugabe family.
So now it's President Mnangagwa's turn to praise his former ally and his achievements. No mention of his errors.
A giant tree of Africa has fallen. Indeed, the bold, steadfast, and resolute revolutionary Comrade Robert Gabriel Mugabe is no more.
Now here's South Africa's leader Cyril Ramaphosa, and remarkably, he's being booed. That's a reaction by the crowd to the recent xenophobic attacks on African immigrants in South Africa.
What has happened in South Africa goes against the principles of the unity of
It's an interesting moment. This is a ceremony steeped in the ideas of Pan-Africanism, of African unity. But I wonder how much that really still resonates here.
We as Africans, we say we are united because we are united.
But there's a lot of talk of African unity, but in practice, there are still very difficult borders to cross. It's still very difficult to get visas.
It affects us.
We are not united as Africans. Like today, we're supposed to come together as Africans. But you could tell, you saw how the stadium was. My fellow people are in South Africa. They're being burnt in South Africa.
Xenophobic attacks.
Exactly.
So you think this is just talk from the leaders, but not real?
Yes, exactly. I would say that from my point of view.
A 21-gun salute signalling the end of this ceremony. Robert Mugabe's casket is being prepared now to be taken out of the stadium. He was due to be buried tomorrow at Heroes Acre, but a dispute with his family means that's now going to be delayed, perhaps for weeks, as the authorities build a special mausoleum for him. As he's taken out of the stadium now, Zimbabweans are left to reflect on all that Robert Mugabe achieved for Zimbabwe, all that he achieved for this continent, and of course, all that he got so terribly wrong.
That was Andrew Harding reporting from a more than half-empty stadium and a very political funeral for a politician who so much divided opinion in Zimbabwe and around the world. A fitting event, really, Rita.
Absolutely, because it represents Mugabe's complicated legacy. This whole response to a history of a figure who led a decolonizing movement, then became an autocratic leader, not exceptional in world history, but the very act of commemoration here, where some Zimbabweans are actually remembering the 60s, the 1960s and 70s, and Mugabe's role in the struggle for equality, for justice, as the real basis of the nation state. But most acts of remembrance gloss over not only the real anonymous heroes of liberation struggles, but recent disappointments with social and political affairs, and in this case, the last years and decade of Mugabe's rule and his complete distortion of the principles of the struggle.
And well into the decline economically of Zimbabwe, and well after the human rights abuses of his rule were known, he was the leader that Western foreign leaders wanted to be photographed with and wanted to be associated with, wasn't he? Because also, of course, he was a liberator.
Of course, this iconic figure remains partly representative of a liberation struggle. In various contexts, he is not unusual in that respect, but wanting to be photographed or to be associated even momentarily with such figures also even happened to Gaddafi, whether in the Arab world or internationally. So for various reasons, whether these are geopolitical interests or otherwise, this has happened with Mugabe and others.
Zimbabwe developed some curious international allies, didn't it, towards the end of Mugabe's life? Belarus, the Belarusian president there at the funeral. North Korea, too. There's a curious detail there, isn't there?
I just noticed with respect to North Korea that Mugabe will be eventually buried in Heroes Acre, and the monument was built with the help of North Korean architects, and this link is evident both in this commemoration and the site itself, but also exemplifies these unusual alliances or unusual collaborations that are impacting Africa in various ways.
5:43 GMT, this is Weekend from the BBC World Service. Now today marks 6 months since Cyclone Idai hit the coast of Mozambique in southeastern Africa. It was the worst ever cyclone to hit Africa, and it affected more than 3 million people, mainly in Mozambique, but also in Malawi and parts of Zimbabwe. Thousands of homes were destroyed, the major annual harvest was decimated, and there was widespread flooding. It made lots of headlines at the time. Aid agencies say more than 2 million people are still facing shortages of food, and about 80,000 people have been displaced from their homes. The UN says it so far received less than half of the $440 million needed to respond to the needs of Mozambique following that cyclone. Edgar Joan is the Mozambique country representative for the Christian Relief and Development Agency Tear Fund, and he joins us now on the line from Mozambique. Welcome, Edgar. How would you describe the situation where you are 6 months on from this disaster?
Hello, good morning.
Good morning to you.
This is Edgar John. I'm the country director for Tear Fund in Mozambique. So 6 months after Cyclone Idai and Kenneth in Mozambique, so we still have 2 million people that are needing food, and at least 77,000 people are still living in temporary shelters. So Mozambique still there's still a lot of needs in terms of aid. So we still need around $200 million to support people, and also the funds need to address more on climate change actions. Helping people to adapt changing weather that we have got in Mozambique. So we need to address the root cause of climate change in Mozambique. Once you see, we have got extreme floods, and also we have got extreme droughts around our country.
Now, your family come from Mozambique's second city, which was extremely badly damaged. Can you describe the kind of effect that the cyclone has, and what you can still see of that effect now?
Yes. Originally, when the cyclone happened in Beira, so part of my house and my family, they've been affected, but at the moment we are still built back better and recovering the situation within our family.
80 to 90% of Beira was flattened, is that right?
Yes, 90% of Beira was flooded, and we had cholera outbreak because most of water infrastructure and electricity and the roads, they were not in place. So the government at the moment is building back better the water supply. And we have the water now, and we have got electricity in place, but there's still a lot of need in terms of basic infrastructure like schools, roof, and hospital. They need to be rebuilt.
When the disaster in Mozambique was the top of the news, when it was the headline internationally 6 months ago, I imagine there was money coming in from abroad, aid money. The UN now says it has nowhere near what's needed to help Mozambique. Is that the problem, that foreign countries are not giving anymore?
Yes, we see that there's a lot of challenge because the UN, they did their bill, but they received 45% of the amount required to build back better the country. So that's why there's a lot of need in terms of support. So we still need a lot of support for the country.
Are the coastal defences back in place now? These are crucial, aren't they?
Yes, yes.
Tell me about that. Is it a question of actually building concrete walls against the sea?
So there's need of some adaptation on resilient building for the coastline in Beira and Cabo Delgado, where the Kenneth cyclone hit, and also Beira Sea. So there's a need of building of concrete along the coastline, and also there's a need of building resilient shelters for those that they lost house.
Edgar Joan, many thanks. Mozambique representative for the Christian Relief and Development Agency called Tear Fund. You're with the BBC World Service. I'm Paul Henley. This is Weekend. And here's a reminder of today's main news. Saudi Arabia says its oil production will be temporarily halved following the drone attacks on two big oil facilities there. And Tunisians vote today in the second free presidential election in the country since the 2011 uprising, which sparked the Arab Spring. Now, all it took was a tweet for President Trump to dismiss his national security advisor, John Bolton, last Tuesday. His services are no longer needed at the White House, was how Mr. Trump put it. Mr. Bolton, however, tweeted that he had offered to resign. What's not in dispute is that there were fundamental differences between the president and Mr. Bolton over a number of foreign policy issues, including Iran, North Korea, and most recently Afghanistan. Thomas Wright, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution think tank in Washington, told the BBC that Mr. Bolton's sacking reflected President Trump's changing priorities with foreign policy.
The story of the last 6 months is that Trump has really tried to pivot from being a militarist in his own mind to being seen as a deal maker in the run-up to the election, and he wants to, meet with Rouhani for a big sort of US-Iran summit. We know he tried to strike a deal this week with the Taliban, and he, of course, wants to continue his diplomacy with North Korea. And I think on all of those and on other issues, he saw Bolton as an obstacle.
So why did President Trump's views and those of Mr. Bolton become irreconcilable? To discuss, we brought together Jenna Ellis-Rivers, who's a member of the advisory board overseeing Mr. Trump's 2020 re-election campaign, and David Frum, senior editor at The Atlantic magazine. Mr. Frum first.
When you hear talk of a Taliban summit in Camp David, people might think that was a good idea. They might think it was a bad idea. But the point is, it didn't exist. It was vaporware. It was a total fabrication. Trump canceled it once he figured out that it wasn't going to happen in order to look powerful. John Bolton is in the tradition of John Kelly, the former White House chief of staff, who tried to make the president be a little bit more like a president and a little less like a toddler, to do some work, to read some briefings. And that's why Trump got angry at him. It's not a dispute over content, because Trump has no consistent foreign policy content. What he above all resents is any check on his appetites, and Bolton, like Kelly before him, had tried to impose some of those.
Oh, well, I would completely disagree with David's characterization. For a president all the way down to the local level of mayor or governor, the elected official deserves to have people surrounding him that will implement his ideas and his policies. And this is not unprecedented whatsoever for a president to ask for the resignation of a high top-level advisor, because we have to remember this is just an advisory capacity, and this is not something unprecedented. I mean, Nixon fired his entire cabinet during his administration. This is not even something to that level. And so to make this out to be some sort of palace intrigue, I think is fully overblowing it. Certainly there was no secret in the media that Trump was dissatisfied with Bolton, but that's his prerogative as president. And to paint this as somehow, he doesn't have a strategy, I think is simply untrue.
You have to take this out of the realm of politics and into the realm of abnormal psychology. When President Trump met with Vladimir Putin, he would do so without a national security advisor there. That is unprecedented. Those secret meetings with no records and no note takers. The whole point of the Trump foreign policy is it is fitful and impulsive. And this Taliban so-called meeting is an example of this. What happened was we'd been running a process with the Taliban under the special envoy, Khalilzad, who was a former ambassador to Afghanistan. About September 1, there seemed to be an interim agreement. At that point, President Trump became envious that Khalilzad would get the credit for it. And so he stepped in as president to try to deliver a magical moment at Camp David, only to discover none of these things were ready. It was totally premature. He looked foolish. The Taliban refused to come. And at that point, he tweeted that he was going to blow up the whole process. John Bolton, whatever you think of his views, was a normal figure good at his job, and President Trump is not a normal figure and not good at his job.
Not at all. And I would completely, again, disagree with David's characterization. I mean, certainly the American people wanted something different. They wanted something abnormal by definition, being not a typical politician. He is a businessman. I mean, businessmen look at quarterly reports. They analyze and they make very, very calculated decisions based on personnel. So this is not something that we can analyze through the normalcy of politics as David defines it, or as other media wants to define it, based on some sort of margin or some sort of box that they want to put President Trump into. I think he's done a lot on behalf of the American people. He's looking very good heading into 2020. I think his base has incredibly grown. Myself as an individual, I voted for him just as a vote against Hillary Clinton. But this year in 2020, I'm on his advisory board. I'm very excited to vote for him, and millions of American people share that same opinion. So this isn't embarrassing at all.
The story we were talking about in Washington immediately before the firing was the revelation that President Trump had been diverting U.S. Air Force flights to Prestwick Airport, which, as you know, in the United Kingdom is a very troubled airport southwest of Glasgow. About $17 million flowed into that airport, which had been running a deficit of £7 million a year, all of it in order to keep open an airport that served the Trump golf course in Turnberry. The Trump foreign policy is about redirecting public money into Trump's own pocket. Everything else is fitful and aberrant. And as we saw with this shambles about the Taliban, there's nothing wrong with talking to
David,
the Taliban.
that's just your characterization. That's your opinion and your editorialization. That's not actually facts. No, I mean, for you to say that is
the $17 million
policy priority, that's not true. When he's looking at North Korea, when he's looking at denuclearization of Iran, when he's looking at all of these things, the China tariffs, those are things that there is a method there. There is foreign policy.
The facts don't go away. The $17 million of U.S. Air Force money flowing to a troubled airport in order to keep it open, those are facts. That's in paper. I mean, it was secret for a long time, but it doesn't become untrue because it was secret. It was true. And the fact that there was no meeting with the Taliban ever scheduled, that was just a Trump fantasy, that's a fact. But again, this has all been extensively reported. It was the Taliban who said, we won't come to the United States until there's an agreement.
The kind of discussion we're becoming increasingly familiar with. David Frum, senior editor at The Atlantic magazine. We also heard from Jenna Ellis-Rice, a member of the advisory board that is overseeing Mr. Trump's 2020 re-election campaign. What do you think, Rita?
I think in this situation, one good thing is that John Bolton is not National Security Advisor anymore, because if Trump is controversial to many, John Bolton has a very long history of controversial standpoints on foreign policy.
He's viewed as a hawk, in that he's keen on starting disputes. What do you mean?
Yes, well, two things that come to my mind are his ceaseless criticisms of very important organizations like the International Criminal Court, and his pride, his statement that he was very proud that he stopped an early ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon in 2006. So these positions that are threatening to global peace and justice.
In the US's supremacy on the world stage, and one would have thought that in that he'd be in line with Mr. Trump.
But they're very different, and that heated debate that you had earlier reflected various divergences in that in as much as Trump is inconsistent in his foreign policy, but he's instinctually anti-interventionist. But now the inconsistency is that while he campaigned on that anti-interventionist platform, he also unilaterally broke very important international agreements like the Iran nuclear deal, and intervened in the world, as in Israel-Palestine.
For example, whether or not we believe that a meeting really was set up with the Taliban at Camp David, it didn't happen. Mr. Trump said he cancelled it at the last minute. The fact that there was even thought of direct talks with the Taliban represents an intervention in foreign policy terms. I mean, every other foreign policy of the US's in Afghanistan has completely failed. He was at least trying something new then, and talks might have led to something.
They might have, and any initiative to broker a deal in a conflictual situation like that will have difficulties and controversies around who you are negotiating with. But
in any dispute with extremists, everyone knows that it's only resolved by talking to the extremists. It always comes to that in the end. Perhaps that was what Mr. Trump was trying to do.
And there are examples of that in American history and in world history, and it worked in brokering peace. But the problem is that there is this big contradiction between wanting to be isolationist on various levels and breaking apart a system of agreements in the world and then intervening.
Thank you. Rita Sacre is our guest here on this edition of Weekend. Live from London, you're with the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service, and we're sailing south.
This is an expedition to a place that people have never been before.
Antarctica's huge Thwaites Glacier is melting with a potentially dramatic global impact. The icebreaker ship Nathaniel B takes on a unique mission to find out more.
We have no idea what the ocean looks like there.
Boston Calling on the BBC World Service at bbcworldservice.com. Finding your favourite radio station on DRM is easy. Search by frequency, station name or even type of programme. DRM, International Radio in the Digital Age.
The BBC and Digital Radio Mondiale. Better radio altogether.